Welcome back. If you want me to keep telling these stories, stick around for more. If you want to, leave a comment telling me from what country you are listening from. Working the night shift at the recording studio in NYC had its routine, but never lacked odd moments. The studio itself was located on an upper floor of an office building, and given the amount of high-value equipment inside, there was a thorough security system in place. You couldn't just get to our floor by pressing a button in the elevator. Access to the studio floor was restricted. The elevator button for that floor was locked, meaning only someone at the studio's front desk could release it. This setup kept out anyone who wasn't buzzed in, ensuring that every entry and exit was under watch. The front desk was equipped with several screens displaying live feeds from security cameras, covering key points: the building's main entrance downstairs, the elevator entrance, and one more inside the elevator. The process was pretty simple. When someone arrived, we'd see them on the monitor at the entrance, then buzz them in and keep an eye on their approach to the elevator. Only once we confirmed they were inside the elevator would we press the button to bring them up to the studio floor. One night, during an overnight shift, it was just me and one other guy working maintenance. It was quiet, just the hum of equipment, when suddenly, around 3:30 a.m., we heard the elevator start up. This wasn't a typical sound during overnight hours, given the building was mostly offices that closed around 5 or 6 p.m. Normally, no one besides us would be around this late. Hearing the elevator was strange, so my colleague glanced over at the monitors to check. The screens showed absolutely nothing. No one was at the entrance, no movement on any of the cameras, and most importantly, the elevator was empty as it moved up. It struck us as odd, but we figured maybe there was a logical explanation. Perhaps someone left behind in another office had called the elevator from a different floor. But as we continued to watch, the elevator kept coming toward us, completely empty. The moment the elevator arrived at our floor, the quiet that had once felt routine became thick with unease. My coworker and I were standing in the lobby, about 15 feet away, both instinctively freezing as soon as we heard the ding of the elevator door. We exchanged a glance, each of us silently questioning what we were seeing. We hadn't buzzed anyone in, and no one had pressed the button from inside. Still, here it was, stopping at our floor in the dead of night with no visible passenger. In those first few seconds, I was holding my breath, half expecting something to explain this. The door to open with a forgotten colleague maybe, or even just a trick of the equipment. But the doors slid open, revealing only the empty elevator, brightly lit yet disturbingly still. There wasn't even the usual hum of electronics that you'd think would bring some familiarity. Instead, the entire scene felt sharp and out of place. As the seconds dragged on, a new layer of tension settled in. Typically, the elevator doors would stay open for just a few moments before automatically closing again. But this time, they remained open, and neither of us could ignore the growing sense that something was preventing them from shutting. It felt absurd, but there was no other way to rationalize why they wouldn't close. The longer they stayed open, the more it seemed as though something unseen was in that space. Standing in the doorway, holding it open, we didn't move an inch. Our eyes were locked on that empty space, a strange standoff between us and the open doorway of an elevator we hadn't called. Seconds ticked by, each one feeling heavier, stretching out until 20, maybe even 30 seconds had passed, and still, those doors didn't budge. The lack of any sound, any movement, any logical explanation was beyond unnerving. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the doors finally slid shut, and the elevator began its descent, returning to the ground floor as if nothing had happened. It was only then that we exhaled, looking at each other with expressions that surely mirrored the same disbelief and tension. In that silent exchange, it was clear neither of us had an answer. The normalcy of the room felt off-kilter, tainted by what we had just witnessed. Once the elevator finally closed and began descending back to the lobby, the tension in the room released, just barely. My coworker and I shared a look, muttering a quiet, "What the fuck, dude?" Our words hung in the air, but we had no answers. The unease from the empty elevator felt strange, almost embarrassing, like we had spooked ourselves over nothing. But even as we tried to laugh it off, the silence of the building and the memory of that elevator lingering open without reason refused to let us settle. The next day, we cautiously brought it up to a couple of the other overnight guys, not really sure if we'd be taken seriously or if we'd get some half-hearted dismissal. But to our surprise, one of them paused, giving us a strange look before saying, "Wait, that happened to me once too." He told us that on one of his solo overnight shifts, he had heard the elevator running close to 2 a.m. He'd gone to check, only to find the elevator doors open, empty, and stuck, refusing to close like they were jammed by some invisible force. He admitted, almost with a nervous laugh, that it had been so unsettling that he'd left the front desk area for a while, doing his best to ignore the elevator for the rest of his shift. He said he'd chalked it up to some technical glitch, but had felt an undeniable tension in the air, as if he wasn't alone in that silent building. As we shared our experiences, the unsettling feeling from the night before resurfaced. Hearing someone else confirm the same eerie encounter made it feel more real, even if it didn't give us any answers. That wasn't all. Other staff members began mentioning odd details we'd brushed off before. Hearing faint footsteps when no one else was there, finding doors slightly ajar that should have been locked, and once or twice even feeling a strange draft pass by, though the building's ventilation was tightly regulated for the recording equipment. The worst part was that none of us could pin down any single thing that pointed to a problem with the building or its tech. It was all just pieces of an unexplainable pattern we were only now realizing. For most of us, it left an uncomfortable awareness during our shifts, a reluctance to look directly at the elevator at night, or to ignore a subtle flicker of movement on the security monitors. From that night on, I worked every overnight shift with an uneasy feeling, and if the elevator moved without reason again, I didn't check the cameras. Night watch shifts at Fort Gordon Barracks generally followed a predictable rhythm, punctuated by occasional routine checks and the quiet hum of the building. That night, I was stationed by the second-floor stairwell, where I could keep an eye on the main areas. The barracks at night felt different, quiet, almost hollow, with most people sleeping and only a few of us on duty. The floors above and below were calm, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of the structure settling. Out of nowhere, I heard a loud shout echo down the hallway. It was sharp and sudden, not the kind of noise you'd expect from people joking around or having a late-night conversation. It was the kind of sound that made you stand up and pay attention. Instinctively, I got up and headed down the hall, trying to locate the source. The sound led me to one of the rooms where a group of soldiers had been staying. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see several of them up, visibly tense, all looking in one direction. They were either standing or sitting stiffly, some talking over each other, clearly unsettled. The whole atmosphere felt charged, like they were dealing with something immediate. Without even waiting for me to ask what was going on, they pointed up toward the ceiling near the wall, a look of frustration mixed with something close to fear in their expressions. One of them said, "They're doing it again," almost as if it explained everything. Confused, I asked them to explain what they meant and what was happening. As the soldiers shared their story, the room felt heavier with each detail they gave. They spoke with a mix of frustration and unease, each of them contributing bits and pieces of what they'd experienced. The story went like this. Late at night, the ceiling tiles near the far wall would begin to shift slightly, enough for them to notice from below. Slowly, one of the tiles would lift, and a face would appear, staring down at them. According to the soldiers, it wasn't just a quick glimpse either. The face would linger, watching them for several seconds before disappearing. It hadn't happened just once, but multiple times over the past few nights. At first, they thought it was someone pulling a prank, but as the days went on, it started to feel different. They began to expect it, lying awake at night and waiting to see if the face would reappear. Some nights, it wouldn't happen, but on others, they'd hear faint sounds from above, and the tiles would lift again. They described the face in vague terms, just enough details to paint an unsettling picture. It was always looking directly at them, with a fixed, almost unnatural stare, and it made no sound. No laughter, no movement, just watching. As I listened, I could see the effect this was having on them. A few were visibly tense, shoulders hunched, while others tried to look indifferent, but kept glancing up at the ceiling. One of the soldiers mentioned that he had tried to shout at the face one night, thinking it was someone in the next room trying to get a rise out of them. But nothing happened. The face simply stayed there, unmoving, until he eventually looked away. Given that the latrine was directly behind the wall, I figured someone might be climbing over from there, reaching through an overhead crawl space. Wanting to resolve the situation practically, I left the room, went down the hall, and checked the latrine. But it was empty, and there was no sign of anyone else. The tiles in the latrine ceiling looked undisturbed, giving no indication that anyone could have used them to reach into the soldier's room. Returning to the room, I decided to check above the ceiling tiles myself. I found a desk, climbed onto it, and carefully lifted one of the tiles where they'd seen the face. When I lifted the ceiling tile and looked up, I was expecting to see some sort of open crawl space, or even a narrow ledge where someone could hide. But what I saw was nothing like that. Behind the ceiling tile was a solid cinder block wall that extended from the floor below to the ceiling above, with barely an inch of space between the back of the tile and the wall itself. There was absolutely no way for anyone to fit, much less lean in to peer down from above. The realization hit hard. Not only was there no room for anyone to be looking through the ceiling, but there was also no gap or pathway connecting this part of the room to any other area. It was physically impossible for a face to appear in that space. Lowering the tile back into place, I stepped down, feeling a mix of confusion and unease. As I explained what I'd seen, or rather hadn't seen, the soldiers' expressions shifted from frustration to genuine alarm. Two of them, who had been visibly on edge since I arrived, looked at each other, and within seconds, they grabbed their things and walked out of the room. They didn't say anything, just a quiet exchange of looks, as if to silently confirm what they'd feared all along. They left the room without hesitation, deciding right there that they weren't going to sleep there for the rest of the night. I heard them talking quietly in the hallway, saying they'd rather bunk on the floor out there than stay in a room with whatever they'd been experiencing. The remaining soldiers stayed behind, though I could tell that what I'd found or not found had shaken them. No one spoke much after that. Instead, they kept glancing up at the ceiling tiles, as if half expecting them to lift again. For the rest of my shift, there was an uneasy silence between us. I left them alone, not knowing what else to say or do. The incident left a lingering effect. Over the following nights, I heard that the soldiers in that room kept the lights on while they slept and would occasionally get up to check the ceiling tiles, even when nothing happened. And though no one saw the face again, the tension around that room remained. The strange, unsettling experience seemed to settle into the barracks itself, becoming something we all tried to explain away but couldn't quite ignore. Working the overnight shift at a 24-hour subway wasn't a job for everyone, especially during those hours when the city seemed to go completely quiet. By around 3:30 a.m., most of the late-night customers, shift workers, travelers, or the occasional night owl, were long gone. The store took on a certain stillness, interrupted only by the soft humming of the refrigerators, the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead, and the occasional clink of dishes in the sink. That night was like any other. I was in the back, elbow deep in dishwater, scrubbing down the sandwich trays, knives, and other utensils from the evening's rush. My coworker, who was finishing up his cleaning duties for the night, was focused on the toaster and bread ovens. His area was just around the corner from me, close enough that we could talk without raising our voices if we wanted to, but we mostly worked in silence, just getting through the night shift tasks. The store was quiet, and the emptiness of the place at that hour had a certain heaviness to it, the kind that made the smallest noises stand out. So when the familiar sound of the door chime rang out, a clear ding that echoed across the empty store, it immediately caught my attention. Without thinking, I called out, "Welcome to Subway," as I always did, expecting to see someone walk up to the counter. But as I stepped around to get a better look, I was met with nothing. The lobby was entirely empty, every chair in its place, the counter clean and prepped for the next customer. Not a single person in sight. Feeling a bit thrown off, I scanned the area out of habit, checking the tables, the bathrooms, and even glancing toward the door. My coworker was also nowhere to be seen. It wasn't unusual for him to take a quick break and hop outside for a smoke, especially during the slow hours, so I figured he'd probably just stepped out. Maybe he hadn't closed the door all the way, and it swung open, causing the chime to go off. Trying to brush it off as nothing, I turned back to the sink and got back to the dishes, though I couldn't shake the odd feeling from that empty lobby. But as I rinsed another tray, the door chime sounded again, loud and clear. This time, it didn't make sense. I wiped my hands quickly, went back to the front, and looked around more thoroughly, feeling a strange unease building up. The lobby was completely empty, and the doors looked closed, just as they should be. After the second door chime, a growing sense of discomfort settled in. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something felt wrong. I walked back to the front counter, moving slowly, scanning every corner of the empty lobby. Each table and chair sat perfectly in place, the napkin holders stacked neatly, and the condiment counter was as orderly as we'd left it. Everything looked normal, yet the whole space seemed oddly off-kilter, like I'd just missed something. I took a deep breath and tried to shake it off, rationalizing that maybe a glitch in the chime had set it off. But when I thought about it, I realized that wasn't likely. The chime wasn't motion sensor activated. It was triggered only when someone physically opened the door. I stood there for a moment, just watching the front entrance, half expecting someone to suddenly appear, but the store stayed eerily still. Determined to figure it out, I walked over to check the bathrooms, thinking maybe a customer had slipped past without me noticing. Pushing open each door, I found both rooms empty and quiet. I even glanced behind the trash cans, checked the stalls, and tried to listen for any small sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the faint hum of the store lights and the muted sounds of cars in the distance. Feeling a little ridiculous for how thorough I was being, I left the restrooms and headed back to the counter, the uneasy feeling refusing to leave me. I waited by the register, eyes fixed on the front door, replaying what had happened in my mind, still searching for some logical explanation. Then finally, after a few minutes, my coworker walked back in through the rear door, carrying a trash bag and looking unbothered. Seeing him there snapped me back to the present, and I called over, "Hey, where'd you go?" He glanced up, looking a little confused by my question, and answered, "Just taking out the trash." His tone was casual, like nothing unusual was going on, and for a second I almost felt silly for feeling so on edge. But just as I started to brush it off, the door chime sounded again, loud and clear. My coworker, caught off guard this time, responded automatically, "Welcome to Subway," and turned to greet the supposed customer. Both of us looked toward the front entrance, waiting to see someone walk in, but instead, we saw the front door standing wide open. We exchanged a confused look, each of us wondering if the other had left it ajar, but neither of us had touched it all night. The door was one of those heavy, weighted types designed to close automatically if left unattended. It didn't just stay open on its own. Yet here it was, hanging open, unmoving. There wasn't even a breeze outside that night, and in all my time at that store, I'd never seen the door stay open like that. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching longer as we watched, waiting for the door to close itself. But it didn't move. We both stayed frozen, neither of us stepping forward, just watching in uncomfortable silence. And then, without warning, the door suddenly slammed shut, the sound echoing through the empty lobby. We both stood there, stunned, as the store fell back into silence, more complete than before. Hoping to find some logical explanation, we walked over to inspect the door more closely. We pulled it open and let it go, watching it swing shut on its own with the usual solid thud. There was no resistance, no drag in the hinges, and the weight mechanism seemed to work perfectly. We even tried opening and closing it a few times, just to test, but each time it shut smoothly and completely, as it always did. There was nothing out of place. The fact that we couldn't explain it left us with an uncomfortable, unspoken agreement to stay closer together for the rest of the shift. My coworker grabbed the mop and began working near the front entrance, while I busied myself cleaning the counters and watching the door out of the corner of my eye, just in case it opened again. The silence between us was thick, and every little noise seemed amplified, making the atmosphere feel even stranger. Later that morning, after our shift ended, we told our manager what had happened. At first, she brushed it off as just a technical glitch, assuming it had to be some mechanical issue. But when we insisted that we had tested the door multiple times and described how it had slammed shut, her expression shifted. She finally agreed to pull up the security footage so we could review what had happened. Watching the footage only made things stranger. The camera showed the door opening by itself, staying open for nearly a full minute without any sign of a customer, a draft, or any movement outside. My coworker and I could be seen turning toward the door, staring at it from the counter as it hung open. Then, as we'd experienced, the door suddenly slammed shut, all on its own, with no visible reason behind it. None of us could explain it. My manager replayed the footage a few times, looking for any signs of tampering or glitches, but everything looked normal apart from that single event. She eventually shrugged it off, joking nervously about the night shift ghost, but it was clear she was as unsettled as we were. Closing up the projection booths at the movie theater followed a standard routine, but as simple as it sounded, the process could become unsettling, especially late at night. The projectors were arranged along a long, narrow hallway on the upper floor, each one aligned with its own small window that looked into the theater below. After the final screening in each theater, I'd start the process of shutting everything down, moving from one end of the corridor to the other. First, I'd turn off the lights in the theater itself, which cast the entire seating area into darkness. I had to make sure everything was in its place, with no leftover trash or signs of mess, before flipping the switch. After the theater lights were out, I'd shut off the small work light above the projector, which left just the dim glow from the neighboring projectors that were still running. In the beginning, it wasn't so bad because several theaters were still operational, keeping parts of the corridor lit and providing the steady, familiar hum of machinery that I tuned out over the hours. Then came the step of covering the platters, which were large rotating discs holding the film reels. Dust was a constant enemy, so covering the platters after each shutdown was essential to keep the film from getting damaged. I'd carefully throw a dust cover over each one, making sure it was secure. As I moved down the line, the lights and noise dwindled projector by projector. After a few, the corridor began to feel different. Each time I shut down another projector, the space around me became just a little bit darker and quieter, until all that was left was a faint light at the far end where the corridor branched off to my station. The viewing windows, usually lit from the glow of the screen below, were now pitch black, leaving me with only my own reflection staring back in the glass if I dared to look. There was no escaping the sense of isolation that set in as I got further down the corridor. I knew logically that the theaters below were empty, the last of the customers gone, but the hallway felt different now, each darkened window like a deep void. Even the routine act of shutting down each station felt slower as I went, knowing that with each light turned off, the corridor grew dimmer, the silence more intense. By the time I reached the final projector, only the faint, distant glow from my desk at the end of the corridor provided any relief, casting long shadows that stretched down the hallway. By the time I reached the final projectors, the corridor felt oppressively dark and silent, each step echoing faintly in the otherwise empty space. The hum of machinery was gone, and the lights at the end of the hallway cast long shadows, barely reaching the last few projectors I needed to shut down. I worked more slowly than usual, the quietness amplifying every little sound I made as I finished covering the platters, each task feeling more deliberate, more careful. It was hard not to feel exposed in that dim hallway with nothing but darkness on either side. I had just finished throwing the cover over the last platter when something instinctive made me glance across the corridor toward the small viewing window for the theater across from me. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but there, in the center of the window, was a face. A child's face, pale as if lit by some strange light, staring straight at me from the dark theater. I froze, my hands still resting on the cover, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. The face was unmistakable, just a few feet from the glass, with wide, blank eyes and an expression that was neither curious nor afraid, just empty. The child's skin looked almost unnaturally white against the darkness around him, giving the impression of a floating face, unmoving and silent. My first thought was that maybe someone had somehow slipped in without me noticing, but it didn't make sense. All the theaters were empty, and the building was locked. I hadn't seen or heard anyone else for hours. For what felt like a long moment, I couldn't move, just staring back at the face as it continued to look directly at me, unblinking, as if it was studying me just as much as I was it. The longer I looked, the stranger it seemed. There was no expression of fear or mischief, just a blank, almost distant gaze that felt out of place for a young child. I strained to see if there was anything unusual in the window, anything that might explain it, a smudge, a reflection from the hallway light. But no matter how much I blinked or adjusted my focus, the face remained there, staring back at me, clearly visible. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to reason through what I was seeing. The viewing windows were set high, far above the last row of seats, a good 8 to 10 feet above the highest row of seatbacks, with no ledges or platforms that someone could stand on. Even if a kid somehow got in, there would be nowhere for him to be standing to reach that height. I felt my pulse pounding, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or some kind of optical illusion, but nothing about it looked like a reflection or an accident. It looked like a real, solid face, too solid, too lifelike to dismiss as just a shadow. I wanted to move closer, to check more thoroughly, but my body felt rooted to the spot, gripped by an irrational fear that whatever I was seeing might change if I got too close. After what felt like minutes, I forced myself to glance away, breaking the strange hold it had on me. When I looked back, the face was gone, leaving nothing but a blank rectangle of black glass. It was just the viewing window again, looking as empty as it should have been. I stood there for a moment longer, feeling the silence settle around me even more heavily, my mind still trying to process what I had seen. The corridor seemed darker than before, the atmosphere even heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange had just happened, something that didn't belong in a normal work routine. I knew I had to finish closing up, but the usual end-of-shift tasks suddenly felt different, like the darkness and silence around me were somehow heavier, more present. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone in that hallway, that somehow I was being watched, even though logically I knew there was no one else in the building. The thought of looking back into the theater windows made my skin crawl, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more frequently, moving quicker than usual to finish up. When I finally returned to my station at the end of the corridor, I tried to brush off what I'd seen as a trick of the light or an overactive imagination from working alone so late at night. But as much as I tried to rationalize it, nothing quite added up. The image of that pale, emotionless face stayed with me, clear as day, each detail seared into my memory. The eyes were too focused, too direct for a random shadow, and the height of the window meant there was no realistic way a child, or anyone for that matter, could have been standing there. The face haunted me the rest of the night, and every slight creak or faint hum seemed amplified in the silence, keeping me on edge as I finished closing down. I couldn't help but scan each window as I passed, half expecting to see the face again. It felt absurd, but the unsettling image had already left its mark. Even after I shut down the last of the projectors and locked up the booths, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I walked down the long, dark corridor toward the exit. The next few shifts, I found myself dreading the end of the night, avoiding those small theater windows as much as possible. I didn't mention the incident to anyone at work, not wanting to seem paranoid or ridiculous, but the experience lingered in my mind. Each time I reached that last, dimly lit stretch of the hallway, I'd feel a cold twinge of dread, that single encounter shifting the way I viewed the entire space. Over time, I started taking small precautions, walking faster, double-checking the locks, and avoiding looking too closely at the darkened windows. Even though I never saw the face again, the memory remained vivid, making the already eerie environment feel heavier with each shift. Eventually, I found myself relieved when I moved on to a different job, leaving the strange, unsettling experience behind. But it stayed with me, a mystery I couldn't quite explain or forget, and a reminder that some things are left unexplained. As a teenager preparing for my secondary school exams, I was used to spending long nights studying in my room, surrounded by notes and textbooks. One weekend, my parents, brother, and grandparents were attending a family function, leaving me home alone, a rare occurrence. Usually, the house was full of activity, with family members moving about, talking, and the TV going in the background. But that night, the house was eerily quiet. For added security, our house had thick steel grills over every door and window, a standard feature in our country. These grills made the house feel closed off, almost bunker-like, giving it a sense of isolation, especially at night. Every door had 2 locks, and each window had bars securely bolted into place. With everyone gone, the house's usual sense of security felt oddly oppressive, as if the grills and locks were separating me from the outside world entirely. My room was at the front of the house, near the street, and it had a decent view of our front gate and driveway. The rest of the house stretched back from there, with the kitchen all the way at the rear. To get there, I had to pass the living room, the dining room, and the stairs leading up to the second floor, where my parents' and brother's rooms were. Each room was quiet and dark as I walked through, with shadows cast by the streetlights outside, adding an almost lifeless feel to the familiar spaces. I checked the clock. It was around 9:30 or 10 p.m., and I figured a snack would help break up the study session. The hallway leading to the kitchen was lined with closed doors and half lit by the low light from a single bulb in the living room. My footsteps echoed softly as I made my way back, each step sounding louder than normal in the quiet. As I approached the kitchen, I passed the staircase that led upstairs. Usually, that staircase felt completely ordinary, but with the house so silent, the darkened steps looked almost foreboding, leading up into the shadowy second floor. When I finally reached the kitchen, I felt a slight relief being in a familiar, well-lit space. I opened the fridge, the faint hum of the appliance a comforting sound in the stillness, and started scanning for something to eat. The brightly lit fridge interior was like a small haven from the darkened house around me, and for a moment, I was able to shake off the strange sense of unease that had been building up. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't ignore how strangely isolated the house felt with no one else around. Standing in front of the open fridge, I felt a little more relaxed, the cold air and steady hum breaking the silence that filled the rest of the house. Just as I reached in to grab something, I heard it, my mother's voice calling my name from upstairs. It was clear, distinct, and carried the familiar tone she used when she wanted me to come to her quickly. Without a second thought, I automatically responded, "Coming!" and turned toward the stairs, heading to the darkened second floor. But as I took the first couple of steps, the strangeness of the situation hit me full force. My family wasn't home. They wouldn't be back for hours. The house was empty. There was no way my mom could be calling me from upstairs. I stopped mid-step, staring up into the dark, silent hallway at the top of the stairs, trying to process what I'd just heard. My heart started to race, the realization setting in that I'd been responding to a voice that couldn't possibly be there. Every bit of common sense told me it had to be some kind of auditory memory, a trick of my mind filling the silence with something familiar. But before I could fully convince myself, I heard it again, my mom's voice, clear and unmistakable, calling my name. This time it sounded more insistent, almost impatient. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't ignore it now. It was too clear, too real to dismiss as my imagination. My hands felt cold as I gripped the banister, my eyes fixed on the shadowed landing at the top of the stairs, as if somehow an answer might appear. I managed to call out, "Hello?" my voice barely louder than a whisper. I don't know what I expected to hear in response, but the silence that followed was almost as unnerving as the voice itself, thick and absolute. I stood there for a few seconds, straining to hear anything else. A shuffling, a movement, anything that might explain the voice. The silence stretched on, pressing down around me, making me hyper-aware of how quiet the house had become. The distant hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, and even that seemed to fade into the background. I felt a creeping sense of vulnerability standing there in the open hallway, the whole layout of the house suddenly feeling wrong. Every shadow in the darkened rooms around me seemed to deepen, as if something was lurking just out of sight. Slowly, I took a step backward, my eyes never leaving the top of the stairs, half expecting something to appear. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my chest, and a part of me wanted to keep calling out, hoping that maybe a real voice would break the silence. But something deeper, almost primal, told me to get out of there, to put some distance between myself and the stairway. I took a shaky breath and turned, forcing myself to walk back down the hallway, even though every instinct told me to run. The house was the same as it had always been, but in that moment it felt unfamiliar, like a place I didn't fully recognize. When I reached my room, I slipped inside quickly and locked the door, pressing my back against it, trying to catch my breath. It was only then that I started to second-guess myself, wondering if maybe it was just the quiet playing tricks on my mind. But I couldn't shake the memory of that voice. The way it had sounded exactly like my mother, clear and insistent, coming from an empty part of the house. Sitting alone in my locked room, I tried to calm myself, rationalizing that it had to be a trick of the mind, an auditory illusion from being home alone in such an unusually quiet house. The minutes ticked by, and as the adrenaline started to wear off, I began to convince myself it was all in my head. I glanced around my room, trying to focus on something normal, my textbooks on the desk, the scattered notes on the floor, anything to ground myself in reality. But just as I started to feel a bit more secure, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps echoed down the hallway, each one measured, like someone was moving carefully, pausing slightly between each footfall. The sound was unmistakable, and my heart rate shot up as I tried to make sense of it. I held my breath, listening intently, hoping to catch some sign that would confirm what I was hearing. But the footsteps were real, and they were getting closer. Instinctively, I relocked my door, gripping the handle tightly as if that could somehow keep whatever was out there from getting in. My eyes darted around the room, landing on a heavy object on my desk, a makeshift weapon if I needed it. I picked it up and crouched down, sliding under my bed, my eyes locked on the crack under the door. The footsteps grew louder, coming down the hallway, unhurried but unmistakable, each one sending a fresh wave of panic through me. My mind raced, trying to explain it. There was no way anyone could have entered the house. The steel grills, double locks, and heavy doors made sure of that. But the footsteps continued, approaching the door to my room until they stopped right outside. I lay there, frozen, clutching my makeshift weapon tightly, listening to the silence pressing down around me. For what felt like an eternity, there was no movement, no sound. I was so close to the door that I could almost feel the weight of whatever was standing on the other side. My eyes remained fixed on the thin sliver of light beneath the door, half expecting to see a shadow or some other sign of what was waiting outside. But the light stayed empty. After several tense minutes, just when I thought it was over, I heard a faint, almost inaudible creak, as if someone had shifted their weight. Every nerve in my body was on edge, bracing for the door handle to turn, for something to try to force its way inside. But there was only silence, thick and suffocating, filling the room like a heavy fog. I couldn't bring myself to move or make a sound, fearing that even the slightest noise might draw attention to where I was hiding. Eventually, after what must have been half an hour, my phone vibrated with a message from my parents saying they'd be home soon. The sound snapped me out of my tense, frozen state, reminding me that I wasn't completely alone. Slowly, I crawled out from under the bed, my legs stiff, and crept over to the door. I pressed my ear to it, listening for any hint of movement outside. Hearing nothing, I unlocked it, cracked it open, and peeked into the hallway. It was empty. No one was there, and everything looked untouched, just as I'd left it. I carefully walked down the hall, flicking on lights as I went, checking each room to reassure myself that the house was secure. Every door, every window, every grill was still locked tightly, with no sign of any forced entry or disturbance. By the time my family arrived home, I was still shaken, but I tried to keep it to myself, not wanting to sound paranoid or unhinged. I never mentioned the incident to them, and I've kept it to myself ever since. Now, over a decade later, I still think about that night from time to time. I can't explain the voice or the footsteps, but the memory remains vivid, and the sense of vulnerability it left has never really faded. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that, for those few minutes, I wasn't really alone in the house. My friend, fresh out of high school, had landed a night custodian job at a local elementary school. Built in the 1940s, the school had an unmistakable sense of history to it, with scuffed floors, chipped paint, and long hallways lined with dark wood-paneled doors. The place had a unique smell, a mix of old books, floor wax, and faint mustiness that clung to the air, something you'd only notice when the building was empty and silent. At night, that silence was absolute. The usual daytime sounds of children laughing, lockers slamming, and teachers' voices echoing down the corridors were gone, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the building settling. He was on the third shift, taking over from the second shift custodian around 9 p.m., and his duties were straightforward: mopping the floors, ensuring the classrooms were tidy, and securing the building to make sure no one could sneak in. After his tasks were done, he usually spent the remaining hours in an old office, where he'd relax in an uncomfortable chair in front of a small, outdated TV until the morning shift arrived at 6 a.m. It was an easy job, and he appreciated the solitude. At first, he enjoyed the peace and quiet, using the time to unwind and take in the stillness of the empty school. However, it didn't take long for him to start noticing oddities. In the beginning, they were small things: classroom lights left on in rooms he was sure he'd already shut down, or a door slightly ajar that he distinctly remembered closing. One evening, he finished mopping a classroom and left to clean another hallway. When he returned, he found a chair had been moved away from the desk, as if someone had pulled it out to sit and watch him. It was strange, but he shrugged it off, chalking it up to forgetfulness, or maybe a draft pushing the door open. His mild curiosity kept him on his toes, and he'd often double-check his work to reassure himself that he hadn't left anything undone. When he heard faint noises, a distant creak or a faint thud echoing from another part of the building, he'd usually walk toward the sound, sometimes with his flashlight in hand, expecting to catch a stray animal, or maybe even a homeless person who'd somehow gotten in. But every time, he found nothing. The rooms were empty, the hallways deserted, and he'd end up standing in the quiet, listening to his own footsteps echo as he walked back to his work. He'd sometimes try to shrug it off as part of the job, blaming the building's old wiring or settling structure. He mentioned the incidents to his boss casually, hoping for some shared understanding, but his boss barely reacted, laughing it off and joking that every old building has its quirks. My friend nodded along, but the lack of an explanation nagged at him, especially as the small disturbances began to build up over time. One night, as he was mopping a hallway, he saw one of the classroom lights flicker on down the hall. Annoyed but still skeptical, he walked over, only to find the door locked, yet the lights were blazing inside. He jiggled the handle, confirming it was securely locked, then turned off the lights and moved on, shaking his head in disbelief. On another occasion, he finished tidying a classroom and returned later to find every desk chair turned in the opposite direction, facing away from the desks. He was sure no one else had been in there since he'd left. As the odd incidents continued, he grew cautious, casting a quick glance down hallways whenever he heard an unusual sound. He started noticing that the same rooms seemed to be the source of activity, with lights flickering on and cabinets creaking open by themselves. He even began to suspect that he was being pranked by another staff member, maybe someone who wanted a laugh at the new guy's expense. He tried staying longer in these areas to catch anyone in the act, but no one ever appeared, and he found himself standing alone in silent, empty rooms. Despite his efforts to ignore it, the eeriness began to build. His job no longer felt as simple as it had at the start, and each night he walked into the building with a growing sense of unease. The once routine tasks now felt more like rituals, something he needed to finish quickly, so he could retreat to the small office and sit with his back to the wall, TV on, until dawn. As the weeks turned into months, the small, odd occurrences my friend had been able to brush off began to escalate into something he couldn't ignore. It started with doors that didn't just drift open, but suddenly slammed shut with force, echoing through the empty hallways. Each time, he'd rush to the source, heart pounding, only to find the room completely empty. What once felt like minor inconveniences had grown into something more aggressive and harder to explain. He'd lock doors behind him, only to find them wide open minutes later, as if someone, or something, was deliberately testing his nerves. One night, as he was sweeping in the main hallway, he heard the unmistakable sound of children laughing. He stopped, listening intently, wondering if it was just the echo of a sound from outside, but the laughter seemed to be coming from inside the school, somewhere down the hallway. It was faint, distant, but unsettlingly clear, like the voices of children playing after hours. He followed the sound, flashlight in hand, sweeping it across the empty classrooms and down the long corridors, but no matter where he turned, he found nothing but silence. After a few moments, the laughter abruptly stopped, leaving the school eerily quiet again, as though nothing had happened. Not long after that, he began hearing the sound of footsteps trailing him down the hallways. They were faint but distinct, mimicking his own steps, stopping whenever he stopped and resuming when he moved. He tried to tell himself it was an echo or some trick of acoustics in the building, but it was hard to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. One night, he even tried stopping mid-step and quickly turning around, hoping to catch whoever, or whatever, might be following him, but he was always met with an empty hallway. The silence afterward felt almost mocking, as though the building itself was aware of him. Then came the sounds of children screaming. The first time he heard it, he was mopping near the gymnasium. A high-pitched scream echoed through the halls, sending a chill down his spine. He dropped the mop, his heart racing, and ran toward the noise, only for it to stop just as suddenly as it had begun. When he reached the source, there was nothing but the quiet, empty hallway staring back at him. The screams were rare, but chilling when they did happen, and each time they left him shaken, feeling helpless and out of place in what was supposed to be a familiar setting. Physical disturbances also grew more intense. Trash cans he'd left upright would be turned upside down by the time he returned to an area, sometimes with the contents spilled out messily across the floor. Supplies he'd organized would be scattered around or entirely missing, only to turn up later in places he hadn't even entered. And on more than one occasion, he felt objects being thrown at him. Small items like pens or bits of paper would fly through the air from behind him, hitting the floor or bouncing off the wall nearby, only to reveal no one in sight. Each time he'd whip around, flashlight in hand, scanning the empty room with growing frustration and fear, his nerves fraying with each incident. Despite his growing discomfort, he was reluctant to quit. He needed the money, and it was a solid job for someone so fresh out of high school. He tried to rationalize it all, chalking it up to an overactive imagination or the quirks of an old building. He even convinced himself that maybe the school's layout was playing tricks on him, amplifying normal sounds into something eerie. But the repeated incidents were starting to wear on him. He'd rush through his cleaning tasks each night, skipping small details just to finish faster, and then retreat to the small office where he'd sit facing the door with the TV on, anxiously counting down the hours until the morning crew arrived. Each night, the strange occurrences chipped away at his resolve, but he felt trapped, embarrassed to admit how fearful he'd become, but also unwilling to continue dealing with the escalating disturbances. He didn't want to admit that he was genuinely scared, so he made excuses, telling himself and others that it was just an old building, just the usual noises you'd expect in an empty place at night. But deep down, he knew that whatever was happening in the school was far from ordinary, and he was just waiting for the next, inevitable escalation. The final straw came late one night, after my friend had already rushed through his usual cleaning tasks and was seated in the small office, his back against the wall and his eyes on the door. He kept the TV on with the volume low, a soft, familiar noise to drown out the unsettling silence of the school. Despite his efforts to distract himself, he couldn't shake the feeling of tension that had built up over the past few months, the feeling that he was no longer alone in the building. As he sat there, he suddenly felt a strong, unexplainable grip on the back of his chair. Before he could react, the chair was yanked backward, and he was flipped onto the floor, landing hard, his back hitting the ground with a thud. Dazed and scrambling to process what had just happened, he lay there for a second, staring up at the ceiling, his mind racing. There was no one else in the room, and the door was firmly shut. He would have seen anyone who tried to sneak in. But the force of the flip left no room for doubt. It felt as though someone had deliberately grabbed and tipped him over, and the realization left him shaken to his core. For a moment, he remained on the floor, the fear and disbelief hitting him hard. He'd tolerated the strange occurrences for months, forcing himself to stay rational. But this was different. This was physical, undeniable, and impossible to explain away. The thought of spending even a second longer in that building was unbearable. He got up, grabbed the office phone with shaking hands, and dialed his boss's home number. He didn't care about the late hour. He knew he couldn't stay another night. When his boss answered, my friend spoke quickly, begged, his voice unsteady, and explained that he was done. He was quitting, effective immediately, and would return his keys in the morning. After hanging up, he didn't bother to finish the shift. He left the office lights on, grabbed his things, and exited the building as quickly as he could, feeling a chill as he walked through the now familiar halls one last time. The night air felt liberating as he stepped outside, and he didn't look back, feeling a weight lift as he walked away from the building. Years later, while catching up with someone who had done some research on the school's history, he learned a disturbing piece of information. The school, originally built in the 1940s, had once had an indoor pool located in what was now a classroom and part of the basement. In the early years of the school, several children had drowned in the pool under tragic and mysterious circumstances. After the final incident, the school administration had the pool filled with concrete and eventually expanded the building over the area, covering it up entirely. The discovery left him rattled. Looking back, the sounds of children laughing, the eerie screams, and the strange occurrences he'd experienced during those long, isolated shifts suddenly made a chilling kind of sense. It was as if whatever lingered in that building, whatever had frightened him so deeply, had been tied to the school's buried past. The knowledge confirmed what he'd always suspected but never voiced, that he hadn't been alone during those nights, and that some part of the school's history remained, refusing to be forgotten. For 6 months, I lived alone in a remote cabin at the end of a dirt road in central New Hampshire. The place was tucked deep in the woods, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to close in more as you drove further down the winding road to reach it. My closest neighbors were about a quarter-mile away, scattered down the road on either side, but it was the kind of area where people kept to themselves. Encounters with anyone else were rare. I'd see a distant figure now and then, or a truck passing along the main road, but actual contact was practically non-existent. It was like living on an island, cut off from the usual hum of human activity. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, with a creaky porch that looked out over the forest, which felt endless, stretching in all directions. At night, the quiet was so profound that even the slightest sound, like a branch cracking or leaves rustling, felt magnified. I quickly got used to the solitude, filling my time with work, routine chores, and the company of the forest animals that occasionally ventured close. Bears would sometimes wander up onto the porch, their heavy footsteps and low grunts unmistakable in the stillness of the night. Other times, I'd find raccoons or deer nosing around near the woodpile, or hear the occasional owl's call echoing through the trees. The isolation had its benefits, though it was unsettling in its own way. The trees pressed in close around the cabin, creating long shadows that cast the area in a dark, almost claustrophobic quiet, especially as dusk fell. The nearest streetlight was miles away, so when night came, it brought complete darkness. Even a lantern or flashlight only lit a small circle around me, leaving the woods stretching out in pitch blackness. It was a strange feeling, knowing that I was entirely alone out there, with no one close enough to hear me if I ever needed help. One spring morning, I stepped outside, ready to head to work, when I noticed that an unexpected frost had settled overnight. The morning air was crisp, and my breath formed little clouds as I approached my truck. The windows were covered in a thin, crystalline layer of frost, casting a soft glow in the early light. As I reached out to clear the frost from the windshield, something caught my eye on the rear window. I froze, leaning in closer, and saw it, written in large, clear letters, "I watch you." The words were unmistakable, each letter traced by a finger, standing out sharply against the frosty surface. My heart started pounding as I processed what I was looking at. I glanced around the area, my eyes sweeping over the road and the thick tree line surrounding the cabin. The woods were still and quiet, nothing but the faint rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. There was no sign of anyone nearby, no footprints in the frost-covered grass, no disturbed dirt on the road leading up to the cabin. A chill ran down my spine as I thought about how isolated I was out there. Whoever had left that message would have had to walk quietly up to my truck in the dead of night, close enough to write on my window without making a sound that would wake me. And in a place like this, where I almost never saw anyone, the thought of someone creeping around my cabin was deeply unsettling. I tried to tell myself it might have been a prank. Maybe a rare passerby who thought it'd be funny to mess with the hermit at the end of the road. But it didn't add up. Hardly anyone knew I lived there, and even fewer would venture that far down such a remote road in the middle of nowhere. The message felt personal, almost as if someone had been watching me for a while, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. As I climbed into my truck, I kept looking in my rearview mirror, feeling a lingering unease, half expecting to see someone emerge from the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever left that message might still be close by, hiding among the trees, watching my every move. The drive to work felt tense, my mind replaying the image of those words traced into the frost. And for the first time, I truly felt the vulnerability of living alone in that cabin. After that morning, things were never quite the same at the cabin. Every day, I'd step outside with a tense anticipation, scanning the truck's windows for any new messages, half expecting to see another set of words etched into the glass. Even though there were no further incidents, the memory of "I watch you" never faded, sticking with me like a splinter I couldn't quite remove. I'd tell myself to forget it, to focus on the normalcy of my daily routine, but the unease was hard to shake. Each evening, as the shadows lengthened across the clearing around my cabin, the sense of isolation weighed on me more heavily than before. Every small noise, the crack of a branch, a gust of wind rustling through the trees, the distant howl of a coyote, felt amplified in the darkness. My mind would wander, imagining figures in the shadows, thinking back to how someone had gotten so close without leaving any trace and without making a sound. I found myself double-checking the locks on the doors, sometimes even bolting the windows, a habit I hadn't bothered with before. It was as though the cabin itself felt different now, no longer a safe, isolated haven, but more like a hidden target. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake, listening for any unfamiliar sound, catching myself at every creak and whisper that drifted in from the woods. I kept the curtains shut tight, unable to bear the thought of glancing outside and seeing someone watching from the edge of the trees. There was a particular unease that crept in as the forest swallowed up the last light of the day, a feeling that whatever or whoever had left that message might be out there, lingering unseen. The usual wildlife visitors, the bears on the porch, raccoons rummaging around the woodpile, the occasional owl hooting from a high branch, felt strangely comforting in contrast. These were familiar presences, predictable. It was people, or rather the thought of a silent stranger in the woods, that had me on edge. Every morning I'd walk cautiously to my truck, inspecting the windows for new messages and scanning the ground around the cabin for footprints or signs of disturbance. Nothing ever turned up, but the sense of being observed lingered. Over time, I became almost hyper-aware of the smallest details in my surroundings, watching for any change, any hint that someone else had been there. Though no other messages appeared, that single encounter left an imprint on me, a reminder of just how vulnerable I was in that quiet, isolated cabin. Even as I finished my time there, I couldn't help but feel a relief tinged with lingering dread, the memory of those words, "I watch you," etched in my mind long after I'd left.